The sun was just beginning to rise over the village of Themba, casting a soft, golden light over the earthy huts and the quiet, winding paths. In the early morning mist, the village seemed peaceful, the place where life followed its natural rhythm. But within the village, there was a man who was always out of place, Themba. Themba was a man of modest means, living at the edge of the village in a small, dilapidated hut. His skin, though dark and smooth, was often dust-streaked from his daily struggles. His clothes were worn and patched, no longer vibrant but faded with time and use. He had the eyes of someone who had seen much of life, eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the world, though they often went unnoticed by those around him. The villagers, in their bustling daily routines, would glance at him with a mix of pity and mockery. They saw him as a man of little worth, someone to be ignored. The children would laugh as they ran by, pointing at his clothes, while the elders would whisper about his failure to build a proper life. Ayanda, the village chief's daughter, would often look at him with sympathy, but even she never came close enough to speak to him. To her, and many others, Themba was an enigma, someone who didn't fit into the world they had built. Every day, Themba walked the narrow trails of the forest. It was a place where he felt free, where the air was thick with the sounds of nature, the calls of birds, the rustling of leaves, and the deep growls of the creatures that roamed within. The animals, in a way, had become his true family. They understood him, and he understood them in return. He wasn't sure when it had started, his ability to communicate with the animals, but it had always been this way. From the smallest antelope to the towering elephants, he could sense their emotions, their needs, and even their thoughts. They spoke to him not with words, but with gestures and feelings. The lions, who were seen as fierce predators by the villagers, would approach him without hesitation, nuzzling him like an old friend. Birds would perch on his shoulder, chirping as though telling him secrets of the forest. This connection with the wild world was his refuge, the only place where he felt truly seen. No matter how hard life had been, the animals never judged him, they accepted him for who he was. One morning, as Themba sat by the riverbank, watching the water flow lazily through the trees, he heard something unusual. A soft voice, faint yet clear, called his name. Themba. He turned around in surprise, but no one was there. The voice wasn't human, it came from the trees themselves, from the very air. He had felt this presence before, a spirit of the land that often whispered to him when he was in danger or needed guidance. The spirit of the forest, the guardian, had always watched over him. "Do not worry, Themba," the voice continued. "Your time is coming. The balance will be tested soon, and you must be ready." Themba's heart raced. He wasn't sure what the spirit meant, but he knew that something was about to change. Later that day, as he wandered deeper into the forest, the sound of laughter reached his ears. It wasn't the usual hum of nature, it was the sharp, foreign sound of human voices. He paused, squinting in the direction of the noise. There, on the horizon, he saw them, tourists. A group of foreigners had arrived at the edge of the village. Their clothes were colorful and clean, and they carried cameras, snapping pictures of the land and the people. They were not like the villagers, they didn't mock him, but they didn't notice him either. They were too busy admiring the beauty of the land, the vibrant hues of the jungle, and the animals that roamed freely. He could hear their excited chatter, their awe at the untouched wilderness surrounding them. The group of tourists was led by a woman, Emily, whose beauty stood out even in the midst of the vibrant landscape. She had pale skin, golden hair, and eyes that sparkled with curiosity. There was an air of kindness about her, a gentle way in which she spoke to the people and animals around her. Unlike the other tourists, who seemed more interested in the exotic spectacle, Emily looked at the land with reverence. Themba watched from afar, hidden in the shadows of the trees, unsure of what to make of them. He had heard stories of foreigners who came to see the wild beauty of Africa, only to take what they wanted and leave without truly understanding the land or its people. But something about Emily intrigued him. He had seen many people in his life, but none quite like her. She seemed to truly care about the world around her, and her presence stirred something deep within him, a feeling of hope he hadn't experienced in years. As the tourists continued to explore, Themba noticed a shift in the atmosphere. The air grew tense, and the once peaceful forest suddenly seemed to hold its breath. The animals, who were usually so friendly with him, began to grow restless. Birds flew overhead, calling out in warning, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble. Without thinking, Themba moved toward the source of the disturbance. The sounds of the forest had changed, from joyful to urgent. He could feel it now, the pull of something dangerous. The animals were afraid, and he knew why. A low growl echoed through the trees, followed by a series of sharp, aggressive roars. A lion was nearby, its presence enough to send the animals scattering into the underbrush. The tourists, who had been happily snapping pictures, seemed oblivious to the danger. In the distance, Emily stood on a rocky outcrop, staring out at the view, unaware of the lion's approach. The beast crept closer, its amber eyes locked on her. For a brief moment, everything stood still. Themba's heart pounded as he sprang into action. He ran toward Emily, moving swiftly and silently through the trees. The lion, its hunger and anger growing, was mere steps away from her. With every ounce of courage he had, Themba called out to the lion, his voice steady and calm. "Stop." The lion paused, its golden eyes narrowing in confusion. For a moment, the tension in the air seemed to dissipate, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Themba spoke again, this time in a language older than time itself, a language of the land and its creatures. The lion growled softly, but it did not advance. Emily turned around just as the lion crouched, preparing to attack. She gasped in fear, frozen in place. Without hesitation, Themba stepped forward, slowly approaching the lion. He spoke to it as if it were an old friend, his voice a soothing whisper in the chaos. The lion hesitated, its fear and aggression slowly melting away in response to his calm energy. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the lion lowered its head in submission and turned back into the jungle, disappearing into the shadows. Emily stood there, stunned. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps as she looked at the man who had saved her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Themba, standing tall before her, said nothing. He simply nodded, the faint, knowing smile crossing his face. The world had tested him, and he had passed. But something else had begun to stir within him, something deeper than he had ever expected. Themba stood in the clearing, watching as Emily tried to regain her composure. The tension in the air lingered, but the lion was long gone, disappearing into the thick forest, where it could roam without fear of humans. The village had always been a place where the wild met the human spirit, where the balance between nature and civilization was tested daily, and it was clear that this was just the beginning of something much greater. Emily slowly stepped forward, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and gratitude. "I am not sure what to say, you just saved my life," she stammered, her voice trembling slightly. Themba's gaze softened, but he remained silent. Words had never been his strongest suit, and the land had always spoken for him in ways that transcended mere speech. The animals, the earth, the wind, these were his true companions. But in that moment, something deep within him shifted. There was something about Emily, something that made him feel seen in a way he hadn't in years. She didn't judge him. She didn't look at him with pity like so many others. She saw him as he was, just a man, but one who could wield something far more powerful than wealth or status, connection to the world around him. "Are you sure you're okay?" he finally asked, his voice rough but kind, as he noticed her shaken expression. She nodded slowly, still unable to fully grasp what had just transpired. "I am fine now, thanks to you," she replied, her breath steadying as she looked around the forest. The other tourists had gathered behind her, all of them watching the exchange with wide eyes. Some whispered among themselves, unsure of what to make of this strange man who had appeared from nowhere, standing so effortlessly in the face of danger. Tumi, one of the tourists, approached Emily cautiously. "Are you sure you're all right, Emily?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. That was terrifying. "I think I'll be okay now," Emily replied, her voice still shaky. She turned back to Themba, her eyes filled with gratitude and curiosity. "But you seemed to know exactly what to do. How did you?" Themba glanced down at his feet, shifting uncomfortably. He had always been different from the villagers and different from those who traveled to see the wild beauty of Africa. His connection to the animals was something he had never spoken of, something that had always made him an outsider. To explain it to Emily felt impossible, yet there was a strange pull between them, an invisible thread that seemed to draw them together. "I have a bond with the land," he said slowly. "The animals, they understand me. And I understand them." Emily's eyes widened in wonder. "That's incredible. I've never met anyone like you before," she said softly, her voice filled with awe. Before Themba could respond, one of the other tourists, Saifo, a tall man with a deep voice and a rich laugh, stepped forward. "We should head back to the village, Emily," he said, his tone playful but still edged with worry. "We can't be wandering out here with lions on the prowl." Emily looked between Saifo and Themba, feeling a strange tension in the air. "I think I want to stay a little longer," she said, her voice firm. "I need to understand more about this place, about him." There was a brief silence as the other tourists exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of staying longer. Tumi, Saifo, and the others had come to Africa to experience the exotic, to capture it with their cameras and bring back stories of wild safaris and breathtaking landscapes. They had not anticipated the real wildness, the danger, the spiritual forces, and the people who lived in harmony with the land. But Emily's curiosity was stronger than any hesitation. She couldn't explain it, but there was something about Themba that intrigued her. Something that went beyond his rough appearance, his tattered clothes, and the way the village ignored him. He was different, yes, but there was a raw beauty in that difference, a kind of strength that resonated deep within her. "I'll be fine. I want to learn more about this land," Emily said again, her voice soft but insistent. She turned to Themba, her eyes locking with his. "Can you show me?" Themba hesitated, his mind racing. He had never shared the forest with anyone like this before. But there was something about Emily, something that called to him, urging him to share his world with her. Without saying another word, he nodded. "Follow me," he said quietly, turning toward the trees, his movements swift and sure. Emily followed, her heart pounding with excitement and curiosity. Behind her, the group of tourists remained at a distance, unsure whether to follow or return to the village. They were out of their element, and the danger that had just passed had made them wary. But Emily was different. She wasn't afraid of the forest or the people who lived in it. She had felt a connection with them, with the very essence of the land, from the moment she arrived. And now, this mysterious man, Themba, was showing her a world beyond what she had ever imagined. As they walked deeper into the forest, the air grew cooler, and the sounds of the jungle surrounded them. The birds, once distant, now seemed to follow them, fluttering overhead and singing their songs. The wind whispered through the trees, as if sharing secrets with them. Emily couldn't help but feel that they were being watched by more than just the animals. It was as though the very spirit of the forest was aware of their presence. "The land is alive," Themba said, his voice quiet, almost reverent. "It speaks to those who listen." Emily nodded, her senses heightened by the beauty and power around her. She could feel the energy of the place, the pulse of the earth, the deep roots of the trees, the ancient wisdom that flowed through the land like a river. They reached a clearing, and Themba gestured for Emily to sit. The air here was thick with magic, as if the ground beneath them held the power to reveal secrets long hidden. I was born in this forest, Themba began, his voice low and steady, as if he were telling a sacred story. My mother was a healer, and my father was a protector of the land. I was raised to listen to the animals, to understand their language. And in return, they became my family. The land, the creatures, it is all connected. When you learn to listen, you learn to understand. Emily sat quietly, absorbing his words. There was so much she wanted to ask, but she didn't want to interrupt the quiet wisdom he was offering. Instead, she simply listened, feeling the depth of what he was saying. The animals, they know me, Themba continued. They trust me, and I trust them. They are not just beasts, they are guardians of this land, protectors of its balance. And I am a part of that balance. Emily's heart swelled with emotion. There was so much more to this land than she had ever imagined. The beauty was not just in the landscapes and the wildlife, it was in the deep, spiritual connection that bound all of it together. And here, with Themba, she was starting to see it for the first time. But as they sat in the quiet of the forest, an eerie silence began to fall around them. The birds stopped singing. The breeze ceased to blow. It was as if the forest itself had gone still, waiting for something. And then, in the distance, the ground trembled. A low rumble, like a storm approaching. Themba's eyes narrowed, his senses alert. He had felt this before. It was the return of something far more dangerous than the lion. Something that would test him, and the forest, like never before. The ground beneath them trembled again, stronger this time. The trees swayed with an unsettling creak, their trunks bending slightly as though bowing to something far more powerful than the wind. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the air grew thick with a strange, almost electric charge. It was as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to break free. "What is that?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible as she instinctively moved closer to Themba. He didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, scanning the dense forest that stretched out before them. In the distance, the low rumble continued, growing louder. It sounded like thunder, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate to be a natural storm. "It's not a storm," Themba said quietly, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of concern. "It's something else." He turned to Emily, his gaze intense. "You need to leave. Now." Emily's eyes widened, and she took a step back, her pulse quickening. "What do you mean, leave? What's happening?" But before Themba could respond, the earth trembled again, stronger now, shaking violently beneath their feet. The trees groaned in protest, and the sky darkened as if the sun itself were retreating from something ominous. Emily felt a cold chill run through her veins. And then, from the dense brush at the edge of the clearing, a shadow emerged. It was large, bigger than anything she had ever seen in her life. At first, it was just a silhouette, but as it moved closer, Emily's heart dropped into her stomach. A massive creature, a force of nature itself, emerged from the undergrowth, a creature unlike any she had ever imagined. It was a giant, dark shadow, with glowing yellow eyes that burned like twin embers in the dim light. Its body was thick with muscle, and it moved with an eerie, calculated grace. It was a beast, but it was not an animal. No, this creature was something ancient, something tied to the very heartbeat of the earth. A guardian, a protector, or perhaps something darker that had been awakened by their presence. Emily stepped back, her hand instinctively reaching for Themba, who stood his ground. His eyes never left the creature, and he spoke in a low, calming voice that only the forest seemed to understand. "Leave us be," he said, his tone firm yet not threatening. "The bond is not broken. You do not have to rise." The creature stopped in its tracks, its glowing eyes narrowing as it regarded Themba. Emily held her breath, unsure of what was about to happen. The air seemed to pulse with the tension between the two, one, a creature of the wild, and the other, a man who had lived in harmony with that very wild for his entire life. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the creature gave a low, guttural growl, but it wasn't a threat, it was a warning. Themba's expression hardened. "You will not harm her," he said, taking a step forward. The creature growled again, its massive body shifting slightly. But there was something in the way it moved, something hesitant. As if it was torn between obeying the ancient commands it had been given and recognizing the man standing before it. Emily stood frozen, her mind racing. What was this creature? What was its purpose? And why was it here, now? "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Themba turned his head slightly, just enough to meet her gaze. This creature was born from the earth, from the energy that flows through this land. It is not evil, it is the embodiment of the wild, the protector of this place. But now, it has been disturbed. Something stirs beneath the surface. Something that should not be awakened. The creature took a step closer, its massive paw sinking into the earth as if testing the ground beneath it. It let out another low growl, but this time, it wasn't directed at Themba, it was directed at the horizon, as if the creature sensed something far beyond them. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "The forest will tell us," Themba said, his voice calm and collected despite the urgency of the moment. "We must listen. It has been disturbed, and we must return balance before it is too late." He reached out, his hand grazing the creature's rough, fur-covered back. The giant animal froze, its eyes flickering with something akin to recognition. Slowly, with a soft, reluctant whine, it bowed its head. "I am not afraid of you," Themba said softly, his voice imbued with a quiet strength. "But I will protect what is mine, what belongs to the land." The creature's body shifted, and after a long, tense moment, it stepped back into the forest, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. Emily exhaled in relief, her breath coming in shaky gasps. She turned to Themba, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What was that?" "That," Themba replied, "was one of the guardians. The spirit of the land, the embodiment of its strength. And it is only one of many that protect this place." Emily could only nod, still too stunned to speak. But there was something else in her gaze now, something deeper. A realization that the world she had stepped into, this world of mysticism, spirits, and ancient guardians, was much more vast, more intricate than she had ever imagined. As the last of the tremors settled and the forest returned to its calm, Themba turned to her with a look of quiet determination. "We need to leave the forest now. There is more at stake here than we understand." That creature's awakening was only the beginning. Emily nodded, her heart still racing, but now with a sense of purpose. She knew that this was no longer just about her curiosity, about the wild beauty of Africa. It was something far bigger. And she was tied to it, whether she liked it or not. The dense forest seemed to grow quieter after the creature had vanished, but the silence felt unnatural, heavy, like a storm had passed but left an ominous calm in its wake. Themba led the way, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings as they moved deeper into the jungle. Emily stayed close behind, still processing the encounter with the creature. The image of its glowing yellow eyes and massive form haunted her thoughts, but her curiosity began to outweigh her fear. "Do you think it's gone for good?" Emily asked, her voice steady but edged with concern. Themba didn't respond right away. He seemed deep in thought, his mind working through something, weighing options only he could understand. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. "The creature, yes. But what it represents, that is still here. The balance has been disturbed, and the energy in this place is shifting." Emily glanced around nervously, as though the trees themselves were watching her, listening to every word. The weight of Themba's words settled heavily on her shoulders. She had come to Africa seeking adventure and beauty, but now she was caught up in something far more profound. It felt as though the earth itself had drawn her into its mysteries. As they walked, the trees grew thicker, their canopy blocking out more of the sun. The air was cooler here, and the shadows stretched long beneath the ancient branches. Emily could sense the change in the atmosphere, the vibrancy of the forest had dimmed, and the quiet felt almost oppressive. "What does all this mean?" she asked again, her voice quieter now. "What is disturbing the balance? And how are we, part of it?" Themba stopped walking, turning to face her. His expression was solemn, but there was a glimmer of something softer in his eyes, a kindness that had always been there beneath his steely exterior. "The earth speaks, Emily. It speaks to those who listen." He paused for a moment, taking in a deep breath of the forest air. "There are ancient forces at work here. Forces tied to the land, to the creatures, and to the spirits who have long guarded this place. But now something has stirred, a force that should have remained asleep." Emily watched him closely. The way he spoke, the way he connected with the forest, it was as if he was part of it. It was as though he understood the land on a deeper level than she ever could. "But, what is it?" she asked again, her voice a little more desperate. She needed to understand. "The spirit of the land is restless," Themba said quietly. "There are those who seek to control it, to exploit it. To take what is sacred. And in doing so, they awaken forces that can destroy everything." The words struck Emily like a blow. She had seen the beauty of the land, the lush forests, the majestic creatures, the untamed wilderness. But she had never considered what might happen if that beauty were threatened, if the very essence of the land was disturbed. And now she found herself tied to it, drawn into a battle she hadn't even known existed. "Who would do such a thing?" she asked, her voice trembling with the weight of it all. "Those who don't understand," Themba replied, his eyes narrowing as if he were seeing something beyond the physical world, something only he could sense. "Those who see only the resources, the wealth, the power. But they fail to see the consequences of their actions. And now, they've woken the storm." Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she processed his words. She had been drawn here for a reason, she realized. It wasn't just her love of adventure or her fascination with Africa's wild beauty. There was something deeper, something she couldn't quite explain, that had led her to this moment. Do you think we can stop it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Themba turned to face her fully, his eyes softening for the first time. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, a grounding gesture that sent warmth through her. "We must try. We are the ones who have been chosen. The land has called to you, Emily, and you must answer." Her heart raced as she looked into his eyes, trying to understand the weight of his words. She was no warrior, no protector of ancient lands. She was just a tourist, a young woman far from home, with no real understanding of the forces she was dealing with. But she also knew, deep down, that Themba was right. She had been called here for a reason, and she couldn't turn her back now, not when everything she had come to love was at risk. Before she could speak again, a sudden rustling sound cut through the silence. Both of them froze, their senses heightened. Emily's heart pounded as the noise grew louder, closer. Something, or someone, was approaching. Themba's eyes flashed with warning, and he immediately stepped in front of her, his body instinctively positioned between her and whatever danger lay ahead. Emily held her breath, waiting, her hand instinctively reaching for the small knife she carried at her waist. Then, through the thick foliage, a figure emerged. It was a man, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a weathered face and dark eyes that gleamed with a quiet intensity. He moved with the grace of a predator, yet there was something about him that spoke of wisdom, of someone who had seen and survived much. "This land is not for outsiders," the man said, his voice deep and gravelly. Emily's heart skipped a beat. The stranger's words were not a greeting but a challenge. And something told her that this was not just any man. This was someone who was tied to the land, like Themba. Themba didn't back down. "We are not here to take," he said, his voice firm but respectful. "We seek to restore what was disturbed. The balance is fragile, and time is running out." The stranger's eyes narrowed as he regarded Themba with a mixture of skepticism and something else, perhaps recognition. "You speak of balance, but balance has already been shattered. And the storm is coming. You will need more than your words to stop it." Emily's throat tightened. She had a feeling this was only the beginning. She had no idea who this man was or what he represented, but she knew one thing for sure: whatever was coming, it would change everything. The stranger's presence was heavy in the air, as if the very forest itself was holding its breath. Emily could feel the weight of the man's gaze on her, his eyes sharp and calculating, as though he could see right through her. She took a small step back, her heart pounding in her chest, unsure of what to make of this new figure who had appeared so suddenly. Themba, however, remained unfazed. His stance was steady, and his voice held the quiet authority of someone who had faced far worse than an unknown traveler. "You know the storm is coming, don't you?" Themba asked, his voice calm yet full of unspoken tension. "And you know that I'm not here by choice. I'm here because I have to be." The stranger remained silent for a moment, his eyes flicking to the horizon before returning to Themba. "I've been watching this land for years," he finally said, his voice low and gravelly. "I've seen the signs. The spirits are restless. The balance is fragile. But there's more to this than just forces of nature. It's deeper." Emily stepped forward, her voice trembling but filled with the urgency of the moment. "What do you mean? What's really going on here? Why is the balance disturbed?" The stranger's eyes narrowed at her, and for a moment, Emily thought he might dismiss her completely. But then, he spoke, his tone somber. "You're not from here. You don't understand," he said. "But you will. Soon, very soon. The land has called to you, and you must answer. But your path is not an easy one, girl." Emily's breath caught in her throat. The man's words seemed to reverberate in the air, heavier than the words themselves. The land had called to her. But why? Why her? What was she meant to do? She was just a tourist, far from home, and now she was being asked to face something far more terrifying than anything she had ever imagined. Before she could respond, a deafening roar shattered the stillness of the forest. It was a sound unlike anything she had ever heard, deep, primal, then filled with an anger that made the earth itself shudder. The stranger turned sharply, his face hardening. "The storm," he muttered under his breath. "It's here." "Is it the creature again?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," the stranger replied quickly. "This is worse. It's the one who stirs it all." Without another word, he turned and began to move swiftly through the underbrush, beckoning for them to follow. Themba was already in motion, taking long strides, his body tense with readiness. Emily hesitated only for a moment before following, her heart racing as they pushed deeper into the forest. As they moved, the ground beneath them grew even more unstable, the tremors becoming more frequent and intense. The air smelled of smoke now, the once fresh scent of the forest tainted by something foul, something burning. "Where are we going?" Emily asked breathlessly, struggling to keep up with the swift pace set by Themba and the stranger. "We are heading for the heart of the disturbance," the stranger said, his voice a low rasp. "The epicenter of the chaos. If we don't reach it before it's too late, all will be lost." Emily's mind raced. What was happening? What did he mean by the heart of the disturbance? And why had the storm, the one they had been warned about, come so quickly? She had come to Africa for adventure, for the beauty of the land, but now she realized that the adventure she had signed up for was far darker, far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The path grew steeper as they ascended a small hill, the trees becoming sparse and twisted, as if they were reaching toward something, or perhaps trying to escape from it. Emily looked up to see the sky darkening rapidly, swirling clouds gathering ominously overhead. "This is it," the stranger said, his voice tense. "We are close." And then, they emerged into a clearing. At the center of the clearing there was a massive stone altar, worn and weathered by time, but still intact. It stood like a sentinel in the middle of the forest, an ancient structure that seemed to hum with a dark energy. Around it, the ground was scorched, as though something had been burned into the earth itself. The air crackled with an unnatural tension, and Emily could feel the weight of the place pressing down on her, as if it were alive, as if it were watching them. And standing before the altar, in a circle of dark energy, was a figure. It was a man, a tall, thin man with hollow eyes and an expression twisted by greed. His clothes were tattered, but the way he stood, the way he held himself, exuded power. He was the source of the disturbance, the one who had awakened the ancient forces, the one who had torn the balance of the land asunder. "You're too late," the man said, his voice dripping with malice. "The storm is already here. The land is mine now. The spirits have no power over me." Emily felt her blood run cold as she watched him. His words were like poison, sinking deep into the heart of the forest. He was the one who had caused this chaos, the one who had disturbed the natural order. And now, he intended to claim the land for himself. "No," Themba said firmly, stepping forward. "You do not understand. This land is not yours to take. You have disturbed forces beyond your control." The stranger, who had been silent until now, stepped forward as well. "And now, you will pay the price." The air around them grew thick with tension. Emily could hear the whispering of the spirits in the wind, their voices soft but insistent, urging them to act, to fight, to restore the balance before it was too late. And then, as if the forest itself had heard the call, the ground beneath their feet began to shake again. But this time, it wasn't just a tremor, it was an eruption. The earth cracked open, then from the depths of the forest, a massive surge of energy erupted, pouring from the ground like a river of fire and light. The storm was no longer just an unseen force, it was real, a violent, overwhelming power that would tear apart everything in its path. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as the ground trembled beneath her feet. She looked to Themba, and then to the stranger, and saw the same determination in their eyes. This was the moment they had been waiting for. This was their final stand. With a single, unified roar, they charged toward the man at the altar. The battle for the soul of the land had begun.